Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are once again looking at the stuff passed to the developers after Operation Hotwire in December 2019. This is going to be the second part of the naval stuff, and we're starting off strong with another heavy cruiser for the Japanese. This is the IJN Aoba. It is a heavy cruiser which of course has some very large guns from it, and this forum post is from Collusion. So thank you for of course posting it and also promoting it. So when it comes to the Aoba, what is it? Well, it's one of two Aoba class heavy cruisers, the second being the Grasse, and these are similar but slightly different to the Fanatical class heavy cruisers, because the Fanatical class had a severe problem with it, and that was the fact that it had so much weight on the front of it, it caused a lot of stability problems. So therefore they tried to fix that when it came to the Aoba class. This was laid down in 1924, launched in 1926, and then commissioned in 1927. So this is an interwar period heavy cruiser, and it was used all the way through World War II until it was wrecked, and we'll go through the story of that in general. First of all, it's time though to have a look at its armament. This thing has 6 200mm guns on it, and that pretty much means they're sat in dual mounting, so you have 2 sets on the front of it, and then you have 1 set on the back. Then it has 4 120mm guns. These are all single around the ship, and 12 24-inch torpedo tubes, which is also incredibly nice to see. The other thing as well is it was extensively modernized at Sasebo Naval Yard from 1938 to 1940. They added new torpedo tubes to it. They also enhanced the anti-aircraft guns, improved the fire controls, and also better aircraft facilities for it. So the bridge also was rebuilt and bulges added to the hull in an attempt to compensate for the additional weight and improve stability of the machine. So therefore, you know, eventually you would definitely see a lot of punching to it. And after recommissioning in October 1940, the Aoba returned to Cruiser Division 6, and it is slightly different to the Aoba we've already talked about, because of course they added a bunch of stuff to it. So if you have a look at this picture, after the refit, it has 6 8-inch or 203mm guns. Then in dual mountings once again. On this picture here is actually a picture of the Tone class cruiser, which is kind of interesting. And then it also had access to 4 4.7-inch guns, so 120mm, and 8 24-inch or 610mm long lance torpedo tubes, which so you can see right here. It also had 50 25mm AA guns, and also some aircraft on board, so a float plane, and then 2 float planes and 1 catapult in its final configuration. So you can see that this machine, you know, it basically went through a refit that a lot of machines went through at the time. This refit pretty much consisted of, oh god, planes are coming at us, we need to put as many AA guns on it as possible, and that was in the form of 50 25mm, which is just insane. The other thing to also mention is the Aoba has, even though it had the refit as well, it also has had many different actual forms of it. So technically you could put maybe 3, 4, or 5 different versions of the same ship in the game if you wanted to. There was a version which had a wrecked number 3 turret, and it was covered over with steel plates, and also had a triple mounted 25mm installed in its place. So therefore you could have one which would only have 2 main turrets, but it would have more AA cover, and this was sent back to truck on the 24th of February 1943. Then on the 3rd of April, it was bombed by flying fortresses of the 5th Air Force 43rd Bombardment Group, and a direct hit the Aoba and hit 2 long lance torpedoes, which exploded, set the ship on fire, while also the B-17s were strafing the decks with machine guns. So it actually had to be beached winch to make sure that the machine didn't sink. Then it was towed back to Truk, and again to cure on the 1st of August, and the Aoba was again repaired and refitted. The 200mm guns were restored to the number 3 turret, and a Type 21 air search radar and 2 Type 96 twin-mounted 25mm AA guns were installed. The maximum speed, though, was reduced to 25 knots overall. So, as you can see from this machine, there are many different configurations that they could add to the game, which could represent the Aoba. Therefore, you could have like 3 or 4 different ships, which were the same ship, just different times in, World War II or the 20s or 30s that it would represent. The next post is from Josh Young, and this is talking about a PRC/ROC naval tree, so pretty much the Chinese naval tree in War Thunder. He talks about in this list the different vehicles that could be added, and also talks about how the fact that it wouldn't just be a copy and paste tree, where even a lot of these vehicles are from other nations. What you would find is they were modified, so therefore they would be specific to the Chinese tech tree instead of just being, as I said, copy and paste. So just having a quick look through them, since there is a lot of them here. A lot of them are very interesting, such as the Qiang Yuan gunboats. Then you've got the Harbour Defense motorboat launch, the Hu Peng torpedo boat, the Hai Ning patrol craft, and also the Type 052 gunboat, and the destroyer, the Chang Feng. I have no idea why this is in Tier 1, apart from the fact that its armament is very, very lackluster. And then in Tier 2, you've got the Yongqian class gunboat, the Ayuk class minesweeper, the Qianmen, or the USS Tuken, as it was before being used by the Chinese. Then, of course, the Xian gunboat, Sen, the Huangfeng class missile boat, and the Haizu class patrol boat. Of course, we need to get a missile boat in there, and obviously you don't have to add missiles to this boat because it has on top of it 4 30mm, so you don't have to worry about that. Tier 3 is obviously destroyer and corvette territory, so here we go, starting off with a very modern corvette, the Type 037, then the Type 051, another modern destroyer, then the Type 053H frigate, and of course the Rudero class DE Taiwan, and the Kagero class destroyer. I love that name, by the way, the Yukikaze. I think that's a really cool name. Then the Gearing class destroyer, which also had access to stuff like anti-ship missiles, so have fun with that. Tier 4, there's only one machine in the form of the Ninghai class light cruiser, which you can see here. Oh no, there's a few others, but sorry. There was only one cruiser, and then everything else was pretty much destroyers. So there's one light cruiser in the form of the Ninghai class light cruiser, then you have the Type 052 destroyer, then the Type 065, so once again modern machines, the Hai Yong as well, which would be kind of crazy. And then for premiums, you got the PC-120 Xingqiang, then of course the Yongfeng, and the Benson class destroyer, the Hangyang, and the Anshan class destroyer. So you can see the whole point of this post is just to show you there are very much machines out there which could make at least a skeleton of a Chinese tech tree, and therefore when it comes to War Thunder, a lot of people look at the air and the ground sections of China, and they look at it and they think, well, I've played a lot of these vehicles before, why would I want to play them again? At least for the naval variants or naval options, there's a lot of, pretty cool vehicles that you could play, which would be different to the ones that we already have in the game. The next ship is an Italian ship, and this is the Giuseppe, which I'm sure I'm saying wrong. By the way, yes, I understand I'm pronouncing everything wrong. It's just easier just to say it like this instead of, trying to say everything with a very odd accent. So this is from TASC, and it's the Italian cruiser, as we said, the Giuseppe Garibaldi, which is a very interesting machine, overall. The Duke Duca, actually no, let's just get up the picture just to show you it. It's right here, the good old machine. The Duca degli Abruzzi class cruisers were the final versions of the Condottieri class and were larger and better protected than their predecessors. So the armament was also increased with 2 extra 152mm guns, and the triple turrets were replaced with twins in the A and Y positions. So that means the ones which are closer to the bridge. The machinery was also revised, which led to these ships having a slightly slower maximum speed than their predecessors, and they were recommissioned later on as guided missile cruisers, which of course is also a fate for many other machines from other nations, which kind of scares me because I have no idea how they would fit in the game. But after the war, it was retained by the Marina Militare and modernized with minor changes of the armament and a radar. Also, she was decommissioned in 1953 and reconstructed as the guided missile cruiser that we talked about before. The new ship was rebuilt in La Spezia Arsenal starting from 1957 and was completed in 1961, and she was eventually named the flagship of the Italian Navy. So you can see the history behind this machine is incredibly important because of the fact that it went through so many changes and also became the head of, some Italian armed forces. So the reconstruction also included a complete overhaul of the superstructure while the hull kept its original dimensions. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting machine. Specifications wise, what you're looking at from this machine, the 1936 version, which is of course the Duca degli Abruzzi class cruiser, you had 10 152mm guns on it, with 2 sets of triples and 2 sets of duals. Then you had 8 100mm guns splattered around the place, 8 37mm, and then you had 12 13.2s, which were eventually actually replaced with 20mm for that AA support. Then during wartime, what was added was some torpedo launchers, so 6 of them, and also 2 anti-submarine mortars, but these were removed in 1945. So this is another machine which could easily have, 3 or 4 different variants of itself put in the game depending on what they wanted, to show. The other thing is the armor on it. So you've got an outer belt of 30, inner belt of 100, main deck being 40, and then the upper deck being 10 to 15. Turrets themselves being 135mm, with the barbettes being about 30 to 100, the bulkheads being 30 to 100, and the conning tower being 30 to 140 as well. It also carried 4 RO-43s. Now, if you want to have a look at the modernization of this machine, this is what it looked like. This machine right here. Doesn't that look incredibly scary? So what it has in terms of sensors and stuff, it has an ANSPS 6, so it has a surface surveillance radar, navigation surface surveillance radar, a free scan 3D anti-air radar, then it has an air surveillance radar and a tracking radar. Has 2 sets of twin 135s, then 8 Ottomalara 76s, and we know how deadly those things are, then 4 UGM-27 missile launchers, and 1 Mark IV twin-arm launcher for the RIM 2 Terrier SAM. And overall, the maximum armor is 140mm on this machine. This is why I'm scared of modern cruisers, if I'm quite honest, because a lot of their weaponry is either incredibly fast-firing, like the 76s, or just is missiles, and I have no idea how you counter them. But at the end of the day, it would be nice to see one of these configurations of the Giuseppe Garibaldi, and I'm sure we'll see it in game at some point, probably the World War II variant instead of this crazy one that we see before us. The next vehicle is from Private Woke, and it's talking about the Jeanne d'Arc, which is of course a French cruiser, and this was proposed for the French naval tech tree when it comes into the game, which I'm sure will be pretty soon. We know that the Italians are coming, so hopefully at some point the French make their way into it as well. So the general history of the Jeanne d'Arc is, after World War I, the French Navy sought to replace and modernize its aging fleet of pre-dreadnoughts, just like a lot of other nations did as well. And they needed machines to train cadets on these new vessels, so they needed some training ships to maintain crew proficiency. So in September of 1928, the Jeanne d'Arc was launched and was completed in less than 2 years and commissioned in October of 1930. The ship, for its time, was very modern. It had the most modern fire control gear and also AA or anti-aircraft weaponry, and throughout the 1930s she took part in diplomatic voyages around the world as a representative of France, looking to increase political influence. As a result of this, France gained valuable relations with much of the Latin American countries, which would later come to her aid during the war. And during the Second World War, the Jeanne d'Arc was part of the West Atlantic Division, which was used to blockade German ports and also be the safeguard for the transport of French national gold to Canada, funny enough. And in 1943, she became part of the Free French Forces, receiving modernization of her anti-aircraft suite and taking part in the Allied landings in southern France, which I believe were called Operation Dragoon, which is a wonderful name for something. And also, for the honourable efforts during the war, the French government bestowed upon the ship, quote, the Order of the Nation, and one of nation's highest military decorations. The post-war Jeanne d'Arc resumed her duties as a school ship and completed 27 voyages until 1964, when she was replaced by La Resolue, a helicopter carrier, and renamed Jeanne d'Arc once more. I really wish we would come up with better names for stuff instead of just picking, older names and just recycling them. So on this machine, you had 8 155mm guns in sets of dual mounts, so 2 on the front, 2 on the back. Then you had 4 single-mounted 75mm, 2 single-mounted 37s, and 8 13.2mm Hotchkiss guns in dual mountings, and 2 sets of 550mm torpedo tubes. That was in 1935, and then in the modernization, so in 1944, when it joined the Free French, it added a ton of AA armament. So it kept its main armament of 8 155mm and 4 75mm, but the other stuff was replaced. So 10 40mm Bofor guns were added in single mounts and 18 20mm Oerlikon guns, showing the need for more AA cover against stuff such as planes. But it would be lovely to see this in game, and I'm sure when the new tech tree comes in the form of the French, we will see a lot of vehicles like this. The next vehicle is from Spatial X, and it's talking about another French machine, the Le Terrible, or Le Terrible if you're British. And what has always been funny about the French is they do have a nice sense of humor. So this ship is called Le Terrible, right? So the Terrible, or the Terrible One. And the class is actually Le Fantastique. So you can pretty much work out, how that works, where you have this class, the Fantastics, and then you have the Terrible One. I really like the fact, that the French went kind of funny with the naming there, whereas other nations didn't, and kind of stuck to either place names and stuff like that. So well done to the French. And also, as I said, this is written by Spatial X. The general history of this is that it was built in 1933, armed in 1934, and it was the fastest destroyer of World War II and even after, which was only recently beaten by an American ship. It was capable of reaching 45 knots, or 83.5 kilometers an hour, which is pretty decent. And the ship and its sister ship at the start of the war were the most modern French ships that they had. And on the 3rd of July 1940, the ship was at Dakar when the English warships started to bombard the French ships. If you don't know about that, I would definitely look at it. It's an unfortunate tragedy that kind of had to happen during World War II, and might make make a video on it by itself, so we'll see, you know, how that goes. But anyway, luckily, the Le Terrible was actually able to escape the harbor, and then it also tried to torpedo some English ships, but instead returned back to Toulon, and then in 1941 returned once again to Dakar, and then in 1943 it went to Boston for modernization, and it was reclassified as a light cruiser instead of a destroyer. Then it was used to participate in the Allied landings on the 9th of September 1943, and on the night of the 13th and 14th of September, the ship would actually send 250 soldiers to Ajaccio, and in the 29th of February 44, it sunk a cargo ship and a freighter, and also severely damaged 3 other ships, and in March 1944, it sank 4 German ships, which is incredibly impressive, along with the Le Fantastique. So the ship eventually was decommissioned and finished off in 1963. So this thing had a long service life of 30 years overall and was seen as a pretty good machine. The armament the original armament on it was 5 138mm in single mounts. Then it had 4 sets of dual-mounted 37mm, so 8 in total, and then 4 dual mountings of 13.2s. It also had 9 torpedo tubes overall, I believe. It's either 9 or 3. It's kind of hard to tell from the way that it's written. It says 3 locations of 3 torpedo tubes, so it's either 3 or 9, and then it also could carry mines as well. And then after 1943, so after its refit and another modernization program on top of it, it had 5 turrets once again of the 138mm, so just single mountings, and then it had a quad 40mm added, 2 other 40mm, and then 10 20mm single mounts, and then 2 locations of 3 torpedo tubes. So I'm guessing it goes from 6, it started off with 9 torpedo tubes, and then it went down to 6 in order to fit all of these extra AA guns, and also some extra radar. So it actually got an air watch radar, and also a sonar on top of 4 throw grenades, so ASMs. So overall, this machine was very much one of those to look out for when it comes to the French tech tree. It's one of those which hopefully will have a really nice time and will be incredibly fun to use in that little bit of destroyer area. Hopefully it doesn't get too high of a BR, otherwise it may have a few issues. The next vehicle we're looking at is once again from Private Woke, and this is the Grasse, and this is another French vessel. I believe it is. Yes, it is another French vessel, and it is incredibly powerful. Just from looking at it from the outset, it actually kind of scares me when it comes to how much this thing has in terms of armament and all of that stuff. So just looking at the general history of it, unlike most other French naval vessels, the ship's original design actually dates back to the 1930s. This is very much a modern destroyer, by the way. Or would it be classed as a destroyer? It might not be classed as, oh no, it's a light cruiser, sorry. So this is very much a modernized light cruiser. The one talked about here by Private Woke is the one from 1956, but the design itself dates back to the 1930s, when it was proposed to be a lead ship of its own class, which would succeed the La Galissonière cruiser class. The French High Command wanted improved AA batteries for its modern fleet, and the roster of few 13.2mm machine guns and 37mm cannons just was not cutting it. So therefore, that's why we saw a lot of the ships before upgraded with 20mm and 40mm. The Grasse used an improved superstructure capable of sustaining additional gun batteries, also leading to a heavier overall weight, and the construction started in August 1939, and it was about 28 to 30% complete by the time the invasion of France occurred. The occupying German forces under of the Kriegsmarine considered turning the unfinished Grasse hull into an auxiliary aircraft carrier. However, work on the conversion halted in early 1943 owing to a variety of reasons. We all know the issues that Germany had when it came to creating aircraft carriers. This was just another one which was added to the problems. So the fact is, the material shortage was apparent, and also French workers didn't want to work on it because they would have to work on something which was considered designed for the enemy. So therefore they would actually hide stuff such as building components in the bottom of the hull of the ship so they wouldn't be able to build it. The de Grasse was hit twice by Allied bombs during the German occupation, and it was finally recaptured by French forces on the 9th of May 1945, so very much near the end of the war. Construction resumed on it in 1946 with a new design emphasizing greater anti-air support for the Navy, which had since shown its value during the war, and then the de Grasse was moved to Brest in 1951, which is in the northwest area of France, to complete work on the reconversion process, and subsequently commissioned on the 10th of September 1956. She would serve for about 17 years as the flagship of the Mediterranean Squadron before being retired in January 1974 as the command research vessel under the Pacific Experimentation Center. So it wasn't just, a military vessel, was also used for other stuff as well. The armament on this machine is 8 127mm, and they were sat in dual mountings, so be very, very, very afraid of that. And then you also have 10 57mm, and one thing to also note is the way that it's written here, I think, is actually wrong. So I think, well, no, it actually has more than that. It has 16 127mm, because it has 8 on the front and 8 on the back. So it has 16 127mm in dual mountings of 8, and then it has, I believe, 20 57mm. It's either 20 or 10 57mm. It's hard to tell. I think when we have a look at it, yeah, it's 20. So it has 20 57mm or Bofors autocannons in dual mountings, and 16 127mm. All of these guns are stabilized, and it also has a fire control radar. So imagine a HMS Tiger but on steroids, and that's pretty much what what this machine is at the end of the day. The next machine that we're having a look at is in the kind of other nations section, and this is the HNLMS de Ruyter from 1935, and this is once again from Private Woke, and this is a Dutch ship, or a Royal Netherlands Navy ship, which, is kind of nice to see. It's another light cruiser, so another large ship, and in the 1930s, the Netherlands was suffering the profound effects of the Great Depression, much to the dismay of the Dutch armed forces. So with major funding being diverted away to the social services, the Navy had little to spend on new warships designs, which badly needed to be pursued. So the growing Japanese influence in the Far East, remember the Dutch East Indies was a thing that, the Dutch needed to control, meant an equivalent vessel was required to match the IGN's large fleet of light cruisers and capital ships. So in an effort to appease the general public, Parliament made a call for a so-called flotilla leader that would perform the same functions as a cruiser, but while cutting costs to keep within the budgets. That normally doesn't work too well, so we'll see, how it did. The ship was laid down in Schiedam in September 1933, and it was also commissioned the following year on October the 3rd, 1936. De Ruyter was meant to supplement the obsolete Java-class cruisers. However, like the HNLMS Java, was fitted with underwhelming firepower in contrast to her intended Japanese counterparts. Yeah, that's definitely an issue. The major action that she saw was in the Battle of Bali Sea on the 4th of February 1942, where she suffered considerable damage by an air attack, only to face more misfortune in the following, the lost Battle of Badung Strait on the 18th of February. So by late February, the Dutch High Command had realized the desperate situation and attempted to counter the Japanese in the Java Sea under the command of Admiral Karel Doorman, which is a wonderful name, and the task force of 14 Allied vessels. On the 27th of February, the Dutch intercepted the Japanese invasion fleet at 4 p.m. or 1600 hours, expecting victory, but the Japanese had an upper hand. With an equally larger fleet, possessing greater firepower than the Allies, and at 2340, the De Ruyter had been hit by a single long-lance torpedo fired from the heavy cruiser, the Hagaro, which set the De Ruyter on fire, and it wasn't able to combat the flooding due to the loss of her electrical systems. The De Ruyter sank early the next morning, taking the lives of 367 men, including Admiral Doorman. Doorman was posthumously given honours in July 1942, and his famous last words were, "I am attacking, follow me." Isn't that just a very odd last words, especially after just getting annihilated? But it is how it is, you know, everybody has their famous last words, and I suppose that's it for him. The fact is, when we have a look at the guns on this, it has 7 150mm Bofors guns, 3 sets of dual mountings, and 1 set of a single mount. It also had access to 10 40mm Bofors guns in 5 sets of dual mounts and 8 12.7mm Browning machine guns. So no torpedoes on this machine, but a decent set of, large guns in the form of 150mm. And the armor, it looks like in general 30 to 60mm, with the turrets being 100mm on the fronts, which it would be definitely useful. The last machine to have a look at today is the HMNZ, so Her Majesty's New Zealand something. I can't remember what the last bit is. But this is once again from Collusion, and it's talking about the Achilles, or the C-70, as it's also known. Now, this is another Leander class, I believe, if I am correct. Yeah, it was a Leander class, a light cruiser. It served, of course, the Royal New Zealand Navy. We already have the HMS Leander in game. I think it's also, isn't it also the HMNZS? I might be... Yeah, it is, definitely, because I remember that. But let's see what it stands for. It stands for Her Majesty's New Zealand Ship. Oh, there we go. So ship is the S on it. And yes, it was constructed of course, by the Royal Navy and loaned to New Zealand, just like a lot of ships were when it came to Canada, when it came to Australia, and also New Zealand, since they were parts of the Commonwealth. And in 1936, it was loaned before formally joining the new Royal New Zealand Navy in 1941, during, of course, the World War II years. So this was a 1930s machine, which served very well under New Zealand leadership, and it was just, once again, a massive Leander class. You're looking at 6 sets of... No, you're looking at 6 6-inch guns with dual mountings, I believe. No, why is it written like this? Okay, so it was first of all armed with 8 6-inch guns in dual mountings, 4 4-inch guns as secondaries, and 12 QF.5-inch Mark III Vickers guns, so 12.7mm guns, and also had quad mounts of Mark 1s and 8 21-inch torpedo tubes, and also had a seaplane on it, just to, give it a little bit of fun. And then it was refit in 1943, and they took away some of its main armament in order to add some AA guns. We see this as well from many other ships, such as the Tribal class destroyers got the same treatment because of the fact of how dangerous aircraft were to these larger ships. So it ended up with 6 6-inch guns in dual mountings instead of the 8. Then it had 8 4-inch guns, and also some in dual mountings. So it had 4 dual mountings overall. It had a quad 2-pounder mounting, 15 40mm Bofors in single mountings, and 11 20mm Oerlikons and single mountings, and kept its torpedo tubes in the form of 8 21-inch ones. And also, since it was built for the Royal Navy but used by the New Zealand Division from March 1937 up to the creation of the Royal New Zealand Navy, it should probably be put into the British tree, even though, you know, of course, it is in New Zealand. It would be nice at some point to see some kind of Commonwealth tree, but we're not there yet. Maybe in the future we will be. Another thing to also note is it was used in the Battle of the River Plate at the outbreak of the Second World War. The Achilles began patrolling the west coast of South America, looking for German merchant ships, but by the 22nd of October 1939, she had arrived at the Falkland Islands, where she was assigned to the South American Division under Commodore Henry Harwood and allocated to Force G, with of course the Exeter and the Cumberland, which have very much an interesting history behind them. So yeah, that is, of course, the ships that were passed onto the developers in December 2019. You can see there's a lot of them. You can see a heavy focus on larger ships, whether they be modern or whether they be very, very old, such as early 20th century, but it is nice to see them all, and hopefully this is a good sign for the future. With a lot of people wanting these larger ships, what we see is a push towards them in War Thunder, and also, you know, from the community, so hopefully people enjoy the stuff coming up. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Chris Giltnane, Daniel Stanton, Jay Wilt, John Ryman, Martinez, Moxie, Super Cacti, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, and also Elove Goat and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.